Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Hello everyone, how are you today? Now we are from group 8. We will presentation about our discussion about the crisis of kingship. Let's get started. The crisis of kingship. During the 14th century, towards the end of the Middle Ages, there was a continuous struggle between the king and his nobles. The first crisis came in 1327 when Edward II was deposed and cruelly murdered. His 11 years old son. Edward III became king, and as soon as he could, he finished this responsible, but the principle that kings were neither to be killed nor deposed was broken. Towards the end of the 14th century, Richard II was the second king to be killed by ambitious lords. He had made himself extremely unpopular by his choice of advisers. This was always a difficult matter because the king's advisers became powerful and those not chosen lost influence and wealth. Some of Richard's strongest critics have been the most powerful men in the kingdom. Richard was young and drawn. He quarreled with these nobles in 1388 and used his authority to humble them. He imprisoned his uncle, John of Gaunt, the third son of Edward III, who was the most powerful and wealthy nobles of his time. John of Gaunt died in prison. Other nobles, including John of Gaunt's son, Henry Duke of Leicester, did not forget or forgive. In 1399, when Richard II was busy trying to establish royal authority again in Ireland, they rebelled. Henry of Leicester, who had left England, returned and raised an army. Richard was deposed. Unlike Edward II, however, Richard II had no children. There were two possible successors. One was the Earl of March, the 7-year-old grandson of Edward III's second son. The other was Henry of Leicester, son of John of Gaunt. It was difficult to say which had the better claim to the throne, but Henry was stronger. He won the support of other powerful nobles and took the crown by force. Richard died mysteriously soon after. Henry spent the test of his reign established his royal authority, but although he passed the crown to his son peacefully, he had sown the seeds of civil war. Half a century later, the nobility will be divided between those who support his family, the Leicestrians, and those who support the family of the Earl of March, the Yorkshire's. Wales in revolt. Edward I had conquered Wales in the 1280s and colonized it. He brought English people to enlarge small towns. Pembrokeshire, in the far southwest, even became now known as the Little England beyond Wales. Edward's advisors drove many of the Welsh into the hills and gave their land to English farmers. Many Welsh were forced to join the English army, not because they wanted to serve the English, but because they had lost their land and needed to live. They forgave in Scotland, in France, and taught the English their skill with the longbow. At first, Owen joined the revolt of Norman West border lords who had always tried to be free of royal control, but after 10 years of war Owen gender border rebellion had developed into a national war, and 1014 he was proclaimed Prince of Wales by his supporters. This was far more popular with the Welsh people than Edward I's streak with his defense at Caernarfon in 1284. However, Kinlaw was not strong enough to defeat the English armies set against him. Him continued to fight a successful guerrilla war which made the control of Wales an extremely expensive problem for the English. After 1040 attained, Glenver lost almost all his support as Welsh peoples realized that however hard they fought, they would never be free of the English. When Glenver was never captured, he did not for Wales what William Wallace and had Scotland a century earlier. He created a feeling of national identity. The struggle in French. By the end of the 14th century, the long war with French, known as the Hundred Years' War, had already been going on for over 50 years. When Henry VI died in 1430, he passed on to his son Henry V, a kingdom that was peaceful and united. Henry V was a brave and intelligent man, and like Richard I, he became one of England's favorite kings. Since the situation was peaceful at home, Henry V felt able to begin fighting the French again. His French war was as popular as Edward III had been. Henry had a great advantage because the King of France was mad and his nobles were quarrelsome.
His 9-month-old baby son, Henry VI, inherited the throne of England and France. At first, Henry V's brother, John Duke of Bedford, continued to enlarge the area under English control, but soon the French began to freak back. Frugal invasion had created for the first time strong French national feeling. The English army was twice defeated by the French, who were inspired by a mysterious peasant girl called Joan of Arc, who claimed to hear heavenly voices. Joan of Arc was captured by the Burgundians and given to the English. The English gave her to the court in a round which burned her as a witch in 1431. In 1435, England's bad general John of Bedford died. Then England's Breton and Burgundian allies lost confidence in the value of the English alliance. With the loss of Gascony in 1453, the Hundred-Year War was over. England had lost everything except the port of Calais. Henry VI, who had become king as a baby, grew up to the simple maiden and book-loving. He inherited the warlike nobles, but he was a civilized and gentleman. He founded a place of learning that still exists, Eton College, not far from London, and King's College in Cambridge. But Henry's simple maidenness gave way to periods of mentalness. England had lots of war and was ruled by a mentality king who was bad at choices and fiercest. They remember that Henry's grandfather Henry of Lancaster had taken the throne when Richard II was deposed. There were not more than 60 nobles families controlling England at this time. Most of them were related to each other through marriage. Some of the nobles were extremely powerful, some of these armies were large. For example, by 1450, the Duke of Buckingham had 200 men in his private army. The discontented nobility were divided between those who remained loyal to Henry VI, the Lancastrians, and those who supported the Duke of York. The Yorkists. The Duke of York was the heir of the Earl of March, who had lost the competition for the throne when Richard II was deposed in 1399. In 1460, the Duke of York claimed the throne of himself after his death in the battle. His son Edward took up the struggle and won the throne in 1491. Edward IV put Henry into the Tower of London, but 9 years later the Lancastrian army rescued Henry and kicked Edward out of the country. Edward heard the advantage of his popularity with the merchants of London and the soldiers of England. This way, because the Yorkists had strongly encouraged profitable trade, particularly with Burgundy, Edward returned to England in 1471, defended the Lancastrians. At last Edward IV was safe on the throne. Henry VI died in the Tower on London soon after, almost certainly murdered. When Edward IV died in 1483, his own two sons, the 12 years old Edward V and his younger brother, were put in the Tower by Richard of Gloucester. Richard took the crown and became King Richard III. A month later, the two princes were murdered. William Shakespeare played Richard III. Written a century later, accused Richard of murder, and almost everyone believed it. Richard III had a better reason than most to wish his to nip him dead, but his guilt has never been proven. Richard II was not popular. Lancastrian and Yorkists but disliked him in 1485 and clanged with a very distant claim to royal blood, though John of Gaunt landed in England with Baron Soldar to claim the throne. His name was Henry Tudor, Duke of Richmond, and he was half Wales. He met Richard III at Bosworth. Half of Richard's army changed sides, and the battle quickly ended in his defeat and death. Henry Tudor was crowned king immediately, and the war had finally ended in the 19th century. The novelist Wetherspoons named these wars the Wars of the Roses because York's symbol was a white rose and Lancaster's a red one. The War of the Roses nearly destroyed the English idea of keeping forever. After 1460, there had been little respect for anything except the power to take the crown. This way not true. Fighting took place for only a total of 15 months of the whole 25-year period. Scotland. The Scots did not expect the Black Death or the other plagues, and they also suffered from repeated war. Scotland paid heavily for its old alliance with France. Because it supported France during the Hundred-Year War, the English repeatedly invaded the Scottish lowlands, from which most of the Scottish kings' wealth came. England renewed its claim to overlordship of Scotland, and Edward IV's army occupied Edinburgh in 1482. Like the English kings, the Scottish kings were involved in long struggle with their nobles, and as in England, several kings died early. James I was murdered in 1437. James II died in the accident before he was 30 in 1416, and James III was murdered in 1488. The early death of so many Scottish kings left government in the hand of powerful nobles until the dead king's son was old enough to rule. Naturally, their nobles took the chance to make their own position more powerful. Nobles kept private armies instead of using serfs for military service as they had done earlier. This new system fitted well with the serfic tribal loyalties of the Highland. The Gaelic word for such tribes. Clan means children, in other words, members of one family, but from the 14th century, a clan began to mean group of people occupying an area of land and following a particular chief. Not all the members of a clan were related to each other. Some groups joined the clan for protection, or because they were forced to choose between doing or leaving the area. The most powerful of the Highland clan by the 15th century was Clan Donald. The clan's chiefs were almost completely independent by the end of the Middle Age. However, Scotland had developed as a nation in a number of ways. From 1399, the Scots demanded that a parliament should meet once a year, and King often gathered together with citizens to discuss matters of government. As an England town grew in importance mainly because the wool trade grew thanks to the help of famous slater. There was a large export trade in wool, rather than fish. While to the Netherlands, Scotland aligned with France bought some benefits. At a time when most of Fairmount was repeatedly destroyed by English armies, many Scotmen found work as soldiers for the French king. For more importantly, the connection with France helped develop education in Scotland. Following the example of Paris, universities were founded in Scotland as Andrews in 1412, Glasgow in 1451, and at Aberdeen in 1495. Scotland could rightly claim to be equal with England in learning. By the end of the 15th century, it was obvious that Scotland was a separate country from England. Nobody either in England or in Scotland believed that the English king's claim to be overlord of Scotland. Okay, thank you for our presentation.